Welcome to Happily Ever After is just the beginning. Keeping your relationship not just together, but happy, and we mean truly happy, is part art and part science. You've come to the right place. Here's your host, Leslie Dories.
You know, there's a reason that the promises a couple makes to each other on their wedding day are called vows. They are the deeply serious promises that are the foundation for the trust the marriage needs to succeed. And the truth is that no one really understands what it is they're promising. And because of this, it's easier, and often without bad intent, to break less important promises that we make to each other. But if you break too many promises, the relationship becomes vulnerable and less steady. So to talk about how this happens, and better yet, to understand how to stop it, I'm joined by clinical psychologist and fellow marriage counselor, Dr. Randy Gunther. So Randy, thank you so much for being on the show and talking about this stuff that happens all the time that we don't realize is damaging.
Right. And thank you for having me. It's my pleasure.
So part of what got me was, like, you wrote an article for Psychology Today, which I read religiously, and everybody should, called When Promises Become Lies. And you point out that trust isn't a guarantee but must be earned on a continuing basis. And I think we kind of know this on, kind of intuitively, but there's actually real reasons for this. Why is this a truth?
That over time, people don't keep promises that they keep at the beginning or plan at the beginning. Oh, probably the most core reason is that people get used to each other and they let things slip because things aren't that important or don't seem that important because so many other things about the relationship are important. Most relationships start what I would call proportional. They're pretty good, like 90%. And so we sort of leave the other 10% along the side and we don't pay any attention to it. But it's really important at the beginning of every relationship to know that within that 10% could be potential deal breakers.
Right.
And lies or excuses or promising things and then not coming through over a long period of time can have two reasons that they can end up hurting a relationship. The first, of course, is that if the lie is really serious. And people keep that in a place where they don't tell the other person. They pretend to say one thing, but they don't tell the person the complete truth, or they tell them an alternative truth, or they tell them a diverted truth. Those are the things that once found out, the humiliation of something that's existed over a long period of time that you've not been part of can break a relationship. But mostly that's not what happens to people. It's the little things. It's the little things that people sort of say and people get used to, and most of the promises they meet, and then these other ones they don't. And then over a period of time, they can rankle if it's in an area that really, really, really bothers the other person, which can, of course, come from childhood stuff. You had a mom or dad who promised and never showed up at a game.
Yeah, but initially, I'll be there, but no, they never there. Right?
You never know, and so people can mostly have good intent. They mostly don't want to hurt the other person. They don't think about it in advance. Maybe they even minimize it in their own heads. Well, it's more important to the other partner. But over time, these little tiny things, they sort of build up. It's like the straw that broke the camel's back. And then at some point in time, when something's really important, that person will do the very same thing that's always been okay. And it's like it breaks. Something breaks. And I can always tell because when I'm with new couples, and for instance, there'll be a wife or a husband who's always 10, 15 minutes late. They'll tell me that with sort of a sweetness. Oh, she's adorable, but don't expect her to be on time. Or, or I'll tell him, always a half an hour, earlier than I think, and that way we'll end up there at the same time. And you can hear a kind of a softness, like I know they're not telling me the truth, but it's okay. But then sometimes people will come in and say, don't expect him to be on time. He's going to be late. He doesn't care about other people. He only runs on his own schedule. And you know that particular excuse is well-worn. You can tell that it's moving into that area where it's like, this isn't going to work for very much longer. So things that even if you started at the beginning with really good intent and not meaning to disappoint your partner or being certain that you're going to be forgiven because other things in the relationship are wonderful, you can start feeling when those things start to not get better real quickly. Or a person will bring them up more often. Like, I'm getting kind of sick of this. If you're going to tell me the truth, tell me the truth. Don't let me depend on you. Right?
But so But this is all about, and this is all goes to the heart of the whole trust issue.
Absolutely.
And and so one of the things that I hear a lot, and it kind of raises my hackles when I hear about it, and this whole concept of unconditional love, that it's like, well, I can say or do anything and you're supposed to love me unconditionally, and so I'm not really harming you by not keeping my word. But that's kind of a real dangerous road to go down, and I think that has something somehow for me this is kind of tying into something that this thing you're talking about, that we just stop really kind of thinking about the impact of what we're actually doing with our partners.
Well, not only that, but I can many times in all these 4 decades sitting in my office, more often than not, people talk at each other, not to each other. Because if we're talking to each other, they would be in the other person's body, mind, spirit, and soul, experiencing what they were saying from the other person's point of view as they were saying it. Mm-hmm. Very, very rarely do you see people do that. Like, can you look at the other person and tell me what you think they are thinking right now as you are saying that? And is that in line with what you want them to feel? Most people
Absolutely.
They don't even think about it. One of the things you're referring to, which is so crucial. First of all, I don't agree with unconditional love. So
I don't either. But
that's a whole other.
That's a whole other show.
What you're talking about is fantasy trust. Fantasy trust is that, this person is going to be the person I want them to be because they promise, and that's who I want them to be, and I'm not going to pay attention to anything other than who they say they're going to be, because I've got a fantasy of who this person promised they would be for me. That is very
Or who
different.
who I think they promise, because sometimes that's not even a true statement, that I have no idea what you think I'm supposed to be, but you've created this whole thing in your head, and then I'm not living up to it, and then you're really angry. It's like, wait a minute, I didn't even know I was supposed to do it.
And unless a person, converts to some kind of new ideology or inherits, the lottery, or in some way is in really good, effective therapy, you can pretty much predict their behavior by who they have been.
Right.
Not who they promise or what they intend or what they wish, but what they've always done. And a lot of people don't want to do that. That's the core of what we call sanity or neurosis, expecting the improbable. But people will hold on to that expectation and sometimes even that entitlement, even though the other person is relatively never living up to it, because they want to believe that person is going to eventually change or eventually going to be better, and they keep paying attention to every single exception, holding on to that expectation until finally, as I said, it's like you look and you think, wait a minute, that's never happened. Why would I continue to expect that? Why would
and that's part of it.
Yeah.
It's
like you go into this self-delusional state where you really either think that you're going to keep a promise, or you really do believe that this person, out of intent, will keep that promise no matter what. And one of the things they did to us in grammar school, which I think is an insult, is they gave us grades for trying. And when you grow up, nobody cares how hard you try. I mean, that only goes for just a certain amount of time. People are what they do. They are what they do, not what they intend or wish or promise, but what they actually end up doing. And that's what you can predict in a person, is what they have done. Unless, again, like I say in my article, you really look at each other and say, let's make sure that our contracts are clear. Let me make sure that I hear what you really can do, want to do, are able to do, not just in some superfluous or superficial way that we sort of say, yeah, sure, but we never even think about it. And we also don't think about whether it's important to the other person. A promise.
And that's one of the things. Yeah, that's one of the things I wanted to talk about, because you actually talk about 6 common reasons that people give for breaking their commitments to each other. And the first one you call about unclear agreements. And that's kind of what we're talking about, are these expectations and these this unrealistic behavior. But it's also unclear agreements that, I will talk with people and, they'll say, well, but they said that they would do it. And I said, well, actually, they may have said they were going to do it, but they didn't. So so what is it that you agreed to? Because person A will say, well, I agreed to do this, and person B will say, well, no, you agreed to do that. And it's like, whoa, were you guys in the same conversation?
Well, do you know that there are 42 meanings for the word upset in a thesaurus? So if somebody says, I'm upset, you say, oh, I'm so sorry. It's like you have absolutely no idea what that person just said to you.
Right.
So you're absolutely right that people they don't inquire, they make judgments or evaluations before they get more data, and that's happening more and more and more, unfortunately, today because people are so in a hurry. There was at one point in time when
or they're doing it by text,
or by text, or not in real time, or even if they're
right.
timing. They're really you have to understand that when you're in somebody's presence, we have something called an aura, which is not woo-woo. It's actually scientifically measured. It's a sort of energy field that comes off another human being, and when you make yourself susceptible to it, you can feel in your gut that what that person is saying is just simply not congruent. I mean, words are about 10% of the communication of feeling, emotion, and affect. So
right.
facial expression, body language, voice intonation, rhythm, touch, all those things are over 90% of communication to people. So when people are texting, I mean, forget it.
I know, it's dangerous.
Is enormous. And then you add that texting to not even being at the same time. You may send a message of distress that 2 hours later you don't feel anymore, and the other person is now newly responding to a distress that no longer exists. So if we add all that complication to unclear agreements, coming back to our point, that agreement may even been somewhat clear at the time, but other variables have now added into it, and now that agreement is muddled but no longer renegotiated.
Well, that reminds me about, because my daughter used to get really mad at me.
At what age?
Well, she's probably 8 or 9 or 10 when, and it's why I would stop making promises, because she would say, she would ask me, well, can we do this? And I would say, yes, we can. Well, then of course something would crop up.
Sure.
Sure. I mean, and I'm talking about something real, like her grandmother got sick, or I mean something
or there
that
was a train.
Right. I mean, something that you couldn't predict, and then she'd get really mad at me because she didn't understand. So I just got to the point of saying, well, yes, that would be a great thing to do. Let's see if we can make it happen, as opposed to saying yes, because she would get really disappointed. But I think that's one of the things when people say this, but then again, it's going to the thing about, well, somebody's late and always late, and understanding that, I say, well, I'm going to be there. And if it keeps happening, then, okay, you're not really dealing with the situation. It's not a one-off like your grandmother got sick. This is something that happens consistently.
And
so we need to be talking about it.
That person late everywhere to everybody.
Right.
Or are they just
don't take it personally.
Well, if they're just late with you, then it's like, whoa, what is that about? Is that an avoidance? Right. Is that, having other priorities that are more important? But if they're late across the board, one of my pet peeves is when people say, well, they just are disrespecting you. More often than not, people are late because they have a tremendous amount of inertia, which means they cannot let go of whatever they're doing.
Or they're like
else.
me. They think they can get in one more thing, which is I'm very bad. I'm very bad with my time.
Right.
But
go ahead.
But number two, and because is about being passive aggressive, and I almost was talking about this when I was talking about unclear agreements, because one of the things that I see all the time, and I go by results.
Okay.
So if somebody says, well, my partner said they would do this, and I said, I understand that they actually said those words, but by the fact that they didn't do it, I'm going to go out on a limb and say they didn't really agree.
Absolutely.
And that's that passive-aggressive kind of thing.
Well, it's passive-aggressive behavior. And you can always tell if somebody comes in your office who's really crazy, they could be married to a passive-aggressive person because they are always paying attention, again, as I said earlier, to what that person wishes, intends, promises, from their hearts, and or are just trying to get away with something, whatever that long, extended list of excuses are. When you're married to somebody who promises and doesn't come through, you must, as I said a little earlier, pay attention to what that person does. Because what they do is what you can predict, not what they tell you.
And and words are easy. It's easy to say something, but pay attention to what they're doing. I think it's that Maya Angelou quote that I love so much, that when people tell you who they are, believe them, and they're going to tell you who they are by their actions.
By what they do, absolutely.
So, and the third one is a little bit self-delusion. I think we've been talking about this a little bit.
It's that people really want to be somebody they're not. They truly, truly, in all their heart and soul, want to be more what their partner, who their partner wants them to be, but really can't, won't, don't know how. And so they keep deluding themselves that if they just try harder, if they just do this, if they just do that, they will in fact meet their partner's expectations. And so every single time something happens, they essentially make excuses to themselves. Well, this happened and that happened and this happened. I really can't do that. They're terrified that if the person knew who they really are, they feel a sense of impostership. That person wouldn't want to be with them anymore. And so they keep, I'll figure this out somehow. I'll make it happen somehow, and eventually I'll be better. But they're deluding themselves because that's not a priority. That's not truly a priority. But they're really terrified to look at that. Because then they're
and being honest about it.
Yeah, well, they sold their partner a bill of goods that's not going to buy. They're not going to buy.
And this is one of those things where people who are trying. Yeah, it's like in the beginning of the relationship where they want. I mean, I always tell people, perky or bubbly are not any adjectives that will ever be used to describe me.
Except for maybe champagne. So champagne is
well,
good.
yeah. Yes. Yeah, and I'm a big fan of champagne. Yeah. But for me, those are not. So if you want somebody who's perky and bubbly, keep on walking, because that's not me. I'm a lot of things, not those two things. But there are so many people who want to be either in a relationship just with anybody or with this particular person, and they know they're supposed to be this way, so they try it, but they can't because it's not who they are.
Absolutely. And again, if a person knows who he or she is, knows what they can offer, knows what they want in the world, they can do a pretty good emotional math problem and figure out their marketability if they're willing to face it. You want to have a lot of dates, go to a town that has 6 more men than women. That you're going to have people waiting in line. But you have to carefully and with a huge amount of heroism and courage face what your options actually are. Age-wise, whatever you look like, whatever you are, whatever you bring to the table, and many.
Oh, Randy, you're talking about things people just refuse to do.
Well, guess what? I'm with the loving heart. I'm extremely hard on people, saying, you're going to have a much better chance of attaining happiness in your life if you're realistic about who you want, what you want, and what you have. Lori Gottlieb wrote this wonderful book, 6-7 years ago, called Marrying Mr. Good Enough. I read this book, but after going on many, many dates with, men with bow ties, and she finally went to this wonderful guru in Beverly Hills, and he said, well, tell me what you want. And so she kept going down this long list, and he said, well, that's 1/10 of 1% of men. So you would be 1/10 of 1% of women in order to, to send out the beam for that kind of person. And he said, so I think we should start cutting back and looking. And she just did it in such an adorable way that it's like, okay, but I do it in a more serious way. It's like, look, you want to be successful. You want to really love and be loved. And you don't want to live your life as an imposter. You don't want to live your life pretending. You don't want to have to make excuses. You don't want to over and over again be caught in those excuses till somebody's lost complete trust in you because they don't believe you anymore. How heartbreaking that is. What if they would have loved you as you are?
Well, and that's the hard part because a lot of us don't love ourselves as we are. But anyway, this is Happily Ever After is just the beginning on webtalkradio.net. I'm Leslie Dories, and I'm talking to fellow marriage counselor Dr. Randy Gunther about the problems caused when partners don't keep their promises to each other. And if this is happening in your relationship, I encourage you to take action now before the damage gets any worse. I invite you to give me a call or shoot me an email and take advantage of my free, no-obligation Create Your Happily Ever After Marriage Breakthrough Session. You can reach me at Leslie, Lesli, at foundationscoachingnc.com. That's FOUNDATIONS, coaching, N as in Nancy, C as in Charlie.com. Or you can reach me by phone at 919-924-0463. And now back to this conversation about not keeping your promises and losing trust. And number 4 is a biggie. And I run into this all the time, the fear of saying no, which goes back to what we were talking about right before the break about being authentic and okay with who you are, because when you are, you can say no. You can say, yeah, no, that doesn't work for me.
And if you've said that from the beginning of a relationship, saying to your partner, look, these are the things that I would give you freely and with love. These are the things I would need to negotiate. These are the things that I want something back for, and these are the things that I absolutely couldn't do. They go against my integrity. I can't do that as a person. It's not who I am.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can do that at the very beginning of a relationship, you're not going to be living in terrible fear of being exposed. And so what you do, you're so afraid to say no or to not do something. You get into these obligatory sort of self-blackmail places where you're terrified that if you finally say who you really are, the person is absolutely not going to accept you. And you're terrified of losing the relationship or being abandoned in some way or being seen as a person who has not been honest, that you continue to maintain this ruse.
Or
not understanding that it's costing you, and it's costing.
Well, and that's the important thing. And one of the things is, or that you were never allowed to voice your own opinion growing up. And that's really where I see a lot of damage. That and it's the fear of the abandonment or the fear of not being good enough. And we learn these things at a really early age. I was just talking to somebody the other day. And his wife did just this. She would consistently say, fine, everything's fine. I mean, and he's actually a very good communicator. And so he said we'd have these long conversations, and so so he would say to her, so everything's good, we're fine, and she'd say yes, and then she dropped the bombshell, that she wanted a divorce, and he's like, well, wait, because she could never, ever growing up admit her own feelings or whatever, because there was her mother's way, and that
there were negative consequences when she grew up.
Exactly.
Tried to be honest. And most children start off being relatively straightforward and honest.
Oh, sure.
And they learn, well, that didn't work. So I have
funny.
Right.
Funny you should say that, because my son was probably 4 or 5.
Okay.
No, he must have been in school, so maybe he was in kindergarten. But anyway, my husband asked him, basically said, did you do your homework? And he knew that the right answer was yes, or no, I don't think he was old enough to be in school, but it was like, did you do something? And he knew that the correct answer was yes. And so that's what he said to my husband. And my husband says, but I knew he didn't do it. I said, then that's not the question you should have asked him. The question you should have asked him was, why didn't you do X?
Well, of course.
Not
or just
setting him
him,
up.
Look, I know you didn't.
Right. Didn't do X. Yeah.
Let's talk about what stopped you from doing that.
Right.
So that the child doesn't start off, sort of in a corner on a witness stand.
Well, exactly.
That's will ask a question they know the answer to, and at some later age.
And spouses do it too.
At some later age, the child knows that's what you're doing, and they'll sort of try to work around that. Kids become experts at prepositions, around, underneath, over. They really get good at that, and so you have to kind of watch them sort of slip out from underneath, because before about age 12. A child doesn't really have a thinking mind of his or her own. They do things to either get them what they need or to keep them from not getting what they don't need. And so they're always watching us to see what the answer will be that will get them what they want.
Well, exactly. And what upset my husband was he came to me and he says, Drew's lying. And I said, well, technically yes, but no, because he's not at an age where he can actually comprehend it, but he knew what the right answer was, and he didn't want to disappoint you.
Well, he didn't want to deal with the negative consequences. Just
right,
like we're
and
talking
so that's
about when people are afraid to say no, or afraid to say I didn't, or afraid to say I'm not good enough, or afraid to say, this is something that I'm risking that I think you might not like. They will literally go along with something. But guess what? If a person does through martyrdom, they're putting money in a psychological bank that they hope to take money out of, emotional money, at some future point in time. When I need you to understand me, you'll be there. But that bank has a hole in it, because the person on the other end is not aware of that particular contract. That's a silent contract that people make out of sort of, I'm going to create this fantasy. And at some point in time when he is going to find out or she is going to find out, they're going to love me so much for all the times I've given in that they won't be angry.
Yeah, except it doesn't work that way.
No,
and so I want to talk about some of the ways you talk about ways that some of the damages from breaking a promise can be mitigated. So, what are some of the things that somebody can do if they, if they have broken a promise?
Well, I think we should probably start with the sort of elephant in the room, which is the biggest broken promise of all, which is infidelity, because it is very, very typical for a man or woman who's found out to do the most heinously painful or breaching of trust to deny it.
Yeah.
And to try to flip it over. Well, you're really being too pushy. You really don't understand what you're talking about. And so what the person does is risk that other person's sanity to preserve their safety. And that can become literally the second wound. Because when you finally do find out the truth, now you've been humiliated for a much longer period of time. So now you have in fact two sins to deal with. And the second one is sometimes worse than the first. So when a person finally confronts you and says, you're just, these things are becoming untruths. I can't even trust you anymore. The first thing you can do and should do is, talk to me more. You're absolutely right. You've got evidence in front of me. There's no way I want to defend. There's no way I want to counter-accuse. This is absolutely 100% true, and I'm really, really, really sad that I've taken advantage of you this way. That will go so far to neutralize or at least take away some of the hurt. The person looks at you and says, "Whoa." Now, does that mean we can sort of talk about this? Is this like open to inquiry? Yes, it is.
Yes, yeah, it does. And then somebody doesn't have to become the person who is hurt doesn't have to become a prosecutor because the other person is saying, "You're right.
Absolutely,
I made this promise,
they don't have to
and I broke it.
But I have this, but I want you to tell me the truth. But, well, how come you're avoiding it?" They start literally pleading for their own sanity.
Yes, and
it's
crazy making. Yeah,
right. In all the hierarchies of development, psychological development, they always say you start with survival and then security and then you need approval. I'm saying, wait a minute. Before love and approval, you need someone to validate your reality. It's critically important. When someone starts messing with your sanity in order to protect themselves, you get really, really crazy on the other end of that, and anybody will. And children will too. When you say to a kid, "There's no monsters in the closet. I looked everywhere. Just go to sleep," and they're going, But if you say to them, "Honey, I can't see them," that doesn't mean you don't see them. But monsters, thank God, Monsters Inc. Can't cross boundaries. They can frighten you. So let's draw a picture of the monster, and because someday you won't be able to see him anymore.
Well, that's the whole creation of monster spray.
Well,
it's like, okay.
They immediately calm down. It's because somebody didn't say you're crazy.
Right.
Somebody didn't say to them you're crazy. And in order to be loved, you have to adopt a reality that's not yours. Well, that happens in adult relationships as well. You cannot see the world differently than the way you see it until you see it differently. And if somebody else is going to protect his or her sanity by telling you you're crazy, you have a whole new mistrust on your hands. And the longer that goes, the deeper that second wound becomes.
So other than admitting and owning your own behavior, what else can somebody do?
And the apology of saying, right away, saying to a person and meaning it, not just an offhanded apology. I can see that you're wounded. I can see that you're sad. I'm sorry for what I've done because I can see what it's done to you. And then you want to ask your partner, are you talking about something that happens all the time? Have I been doing this for over a long period of time? And you want to ask your partner, how important is this to you? And is this the tip of an iceberg? Is this reminding you of a childhood trauma like you just talked about, Leslie? Or is this something that, that's tied to something else? That you had another thing you were supposed to give me if I did this, and now you feel like you're obligated to give me, but it's not fair. In other words, you want to go into inquiry. You want to get that person to talk more, to give more information, because when you've decided to be there and stand there and listen and validate another person's reality, you make hundreds of points by not having to defend or invalidate that.
Well, and here's the thing that I think people miss is that by honoring your reality, it doesn't diminish or mean that mine isn't just as real. And I think this is where people get so spun out by the fact that their partner views the world differently than they do, which, I mean, to me that's, maybe this is my gift, I don't know, because to me that's a duh kind of thing. Of course we all view the world differently, but it's very hard for people to acknowledge somebody else's perspective. I mean, we're dealing with that right now all over the world.
Of course.
The fact that this thing means something to you where it doesn't matter to me, and if we can be curious and open and validating about that, then I think we're all going to be in much better places.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. Not only that, when people are open and listen much more deeply, they sometimes come to a place of agreement.
Well, exactly, because they can find that common ground. And, this is just a fantastic conversation. So anything else about mitigating
if I could give people like one sound bite, it would be, promise less than you can deliver and deliver more than you promise. So, for instance, if you're late, and the person's it's always 15, 20, tell a person you're going to be home later and come home early.
Right.
It sounds deceptively simple, but it actually works.
Right. And, and a lot of these things, and I tell people about having a good relationships, that these concepts are relatively simple. They're not always easy to implement, but part of it's like you said, it's like try to put yourself in the other person's position.
Right.
And
by the way, if you always start out when you want to change any behavior with doing the simplest thing first, because if that's really what's wrong, like I was dealing with a couple where this man had the kind of work schedule that he never knew when he was going to get home, and so his wife didn't like to leave the door open because she grew up in New York where it was very unsafe, so she'd lock it, and he would always forget his keys. So he could wake her up anywhere from 7 at night to 2 in the morning. And so I said to them, well, can you put kind of a lockbox on the front of the door? And that worked because that
what
was
an
the
answer.
only problem.
Right.
But in fact, he was being aggressive, or in fact, he was, God forbid, having an affair, or in fact, he was getting back at her for not being waiting up, whatever. If he had nefarious reasons or an agenda, that would not have worked.
Right.
So you start with the simple.
Oh, I love it.
And when you start with something simple, sometimes the deeper issues can then emerge.
Well, that's why I always tell people, I said, right, if I'm still upset about something, days later or weeks later, then it isn't really about, the dish on the sink
and it gives you
or
the
whatever.
It takes her to dig that out. Or if you defend too quickly or make that the issue, you never get to the real driver or the real agenda.
Right. So, Randy, where can people find out more? Because I know you write all the time.
Yeah, I do.
And you've got some great information. So, where can people find out more about you, more about how you help people?
All right, I've written about 130 articles for Psychology Today in the last 4 years, and you can get to all of those on the icon on my website, which is Randy Gunther, that's with an I, RandyGunther.com. You can do that. You can also, anyone is absolutely welcome to contact me on my website, which is randygunther@cox.net. When I have the time, I'm delighted to do personal responses. I can't give a lot of advice. Number one, you can't do that unless it's safe. But also, I don't have a lot of time, but I will always listen, and I'm glad to listen. And on my website, it also talks about some of the new projects I'm doing, a couple of books I've written, and a little bit about my philosophy, about who I am, about what I do, and why I do what I do. And I went back to school in my 30s because when I grew up, I put my husband.
Sounds like me.
I put my husband through school into his master's degree, and then I went back myself later on for 9 years with 3 kids at home, getting all these 4 different degrees, and then I've now had over 100,000 hours of experience. And all I can tell you from that is that
So you know what you're talking about.
Well, the privilege of being let into people's hearts and the sacred places of their life never ceases to fill me with awe.
Yeah,
because it is so unbelievably privileged to do that. And in today's world, therapy has become almost a reason for people to have someone genuinely listen, because that particular capability we're losing relatively quickly with the media.
It is.
And so, when people sit down and they say, "Oh my God, you actually heard me," and I'm saying how sad that's not happening elsewhere.
Right. And I love what you talk about, because for me, I am always so very honored by the trust that people place in me when they walk through my door. And as we've been talking about today, trust is essential for any successful relationship.
Absolutely. And by the way, people can renegotiate. I mean, people don't understand you can revisit, because the way I was before.
Right.
I've emerged, or I've changed, or I've transformed, or my needs have changed, and I need to take that altar place we knelt in parallel to initially, and I need to redefine it so that you can trust me. Because I'm not the person I was before. And if people aren't willing, like I say at the beginning of this article, to keep that up, to keep up to date. When people lose another person, their greatest grief is what they wish just they'd said or done.
Right. And so, so by the way, go to Randy's website and learn about all these things. And, trust in your marriage, that's what your marriage is based on. And
Absolutely.
We talked a little bit before about infidelity, and trust can be rebuilt, but it is much easier not to lose it in the first place. So if you make a promise but are about to break it, you may want to pause and figure out why.
Absolutely.
Yes, it could be difficult to keep it, but the damage done if you don't may be even harder to address. So keep listening to the show, keep learning about all the things that can make your marriage fantastic, and until next week, stay loving.